All right, I think we can get started. I'm just going to quickly introduce our presenter. Thank you all so much for being with us today. You're attending today's training on Introduction to Deaf Culture with the Connecticut Alliance to End Sexual Violence. And our presenter today is Tammy Ennis, and she's going to get things started. Let me just pull up your slides, Tammy.
Thank you, Kelsey. Good afternoon, everyone. I am Tammy Ennis, and my sign name is TE on my shoulder. I work at American School for the Deaf as a school social worker. For those who are attending today, I just want to give you a heads up that I am having a bit of a technical issue. The interpreter has warned that it's been difficult to see me, but hopefully from this point on, we'll be okay and good to go. Today's presentation is an introduction to deaf culture. It is a very basic introduction that will just touch on a few points that certainly will not leave you as an expert, that would take a lifetime to learn. So today's presentation will help you get a better understanding about deaf people, the deaf community, and deaf culture itself. Again, my sign name is TE on my shoulder. And that's a good way to start. How to get a sign name. So you get a sign name from a deaf person who assigns one to you. You can go on to the next slide. Today's presentation is something I want you to feel free to stop and ask questions throughout. Please don't be concerned about upsetting anyone or asking a question you may not feel is a good one, because this is a safe space and we are here for this open discussion as well. Next. So as an icebreaker, out of curiosity, has any of you met a deaf person before? And if so, what were your thoughts or feelings the first time you did meet a deaf person? And you can put the answers in the chat. Okay, I see no responses in the chat as of right now. Oh, okay, they're coming up now. Great, so it seems that most of you have met a deaf person or several before. Some of you mentioned feeling nervous and utilizing an interpreter being difficult, and especially in any sort of first-time situation. I can understand and relate to that as well, and that's part of what we are going to be discussing today. Great comments. I'm going to go on to the next slide. So I always give a few seconds when the slides change for everyone to have an opportunity to look at them before I speak. All right, so this slide is something that's pretty common. I know that those of us who use text message often tend to know that autocorrect is not always our best friend. And one of my biggest pet peeves is the autocorrection that changes from deaf to dead. Hence, and the reason behind that being that I am pretty much alive. And so seeing someone say someone is dead instead of deaf is difficult. So it's something we do like to warn everyone about. Just make sure you check that and, clarify that it doesn't have the wrong word. When COVID hit, American School for the Deaf had a parade. And it was a car parade, because there are some students who stay on campus year round. And that was true even during COVID. News channels came out, and kids on campus were super excited to see the news story about their school. And that day they posted their story, and the kids all sat in front of it and saw the caption being American School for the Dead. Needless to say, there was an apology issued the next day, and they tried to make it right, but the students had already seen that, and emotionally it was very difficult for them. Any questions right now before we move on? Okay, next slide. A common misconception is that there's not a variety amongst deaf people, but there truly is. Oftentimes what people assume is if you meet one person who's deaf, you understand all people who are deaf. But much like those who are hearing, we have a wide variety of backgrounds, preferences, likes and dislikes, and that doesn't change just because we are deaf. So when working with any deaf person, certainly keep that in mind and don't apply that stereotype. Communication needs are different, language preferences are different, backgrounds are different, and everyone is their own person. Next slide. I'll give you a moment to look at this. So you can see there's some terms in red, and those are terms we refer to as don'ts. The terms that are in blue are the accepted terms that we utilize in our community. Saying deaf and dumb is definitely not acceptable. There are some intellectual differences amongst all deaf people, just as there are hearing people, but that term is not acceptable. The next term being deaf mute. Assuming that a person who is deaf cannot speak is completely inaccurate. Some can speak very well, some do not, and some have what we refer to as the deaf voice, where it may not sound the same as yours, but it is the voice that we use. Some deaf individuals have a very loud voice because they're unable to hear, or a high-pitched voice because they can't control the pitch. Sometimes that can be easily criticized because of our voice sounds, and certainly we don't encourage that. The third term here, hearing impaired in red, that term impaired is really focused on the negative. People tend to say, oh, it's politically correct, which is not accurate. That term was popular in the 70s and 80s, but in today's day and age, it's only used really by the medical field audiologists who unfortunately are focused on what's not in existence rather than the remainder of our beings that are in existence. The next side, the blue terms, the term deaf used to be, we do have a large D deaf, small d deaf, and basically that is applicable to the identity that you use. But just using the word deaf is very much accepted in our culture. The second term, hard of hearing, is those who typically can use the phone, have some partial residual hearing. Hard of hearing individuals may be able to switch between both the hearing world and deaf world fairly easily. Some of those individuals who are hard of hearing don't speak well, though. So again, that variety does impact every level of our culture. Those who may be able to hear well may not speak well, or speak well may not hear as well. So it is not a one size fits all. And then that big D for the term deaf is somebody who's identified as immersed in the deaf culture, is proud of their deafness, and doesn't focus on the hearing loss, but focuses on who they are instead. The majority of the deaf community would identify as this type of deaf person. And the last term on this page, maybe a term that's new to you, the term is autism. And that's the discrimination of any person who is deaf or hard of hearing based on their hearing or lack thereof. Any questions regarding these terms? Let me just check the chat. Okay, looks like we're good to go. So we can go on to the next slide. So these are some definitions for you to get familiar with. I'll give you a moment to read them. Who has seen the movie Coda by chance?
If you haven't seen CODA yet, then I strongly encourage you to. So these are some definitions regarding that concept of CODA. So CODA is a person who is born to deaf parents or raised by deaf people. They're known as a CODA, a child of a deaf adult. CODA with a K typically refers to young children, those who are still children who have deaf parents or deaf guardians. But either term, they're somewhat interchangeable, but typically if we're talking about adults who have deaf parents, then we use the C, and those under 18, we use a K. Hearing, that's what the deaf community refers to as those who can hear and speak. We call them hearing. So if you ever come across that word now, you have a better understanding of what that means. Deaf blind refers to a person who has a hearing loss and also a loss that affects their vision. And those combinations and the levels of both vary greatly, and I'll get into that a bit more in the next slide. Late deafened. So that refers to a person who becomes deaf at a later point in their life. Perhaps they're former military, so they're around loud noises and they lose their hearing, or just from elder reasons, just getting old, people lose their hearing, or maybe an accident of some type. Maybe you're born with some type of illness that causes progressive hearing loss, like meningitis or something. So over time, you slowly lose more and more of that ability to hear. Any questions? Okay, we can go to the next slide. Oh, I see a question just came up. If there's a term for a person who can hear unilaterally with one ear, and really it would really depend on how they self-identify. They would be the ones to determine that, because they could identify anywhere on that spectrum. So to go into deafblind a little bit more, again, there's a variety of different types of vision loss, some who just have field of vision loss, some who have peripheral loss. You can see the variation here. And you'll notice that deafblind is the two words put together, there's no space. And that's because the deafblind community believes that they withhold both identities simultaneously, and they're not something that can be parsed. Deafblindness is usually caused from some type of genetic mutation, something like Usher syndrome. And in terms of communication, we also see a lot of variability there. Just reading the comment here. So those in the deafblind community, their access to transportation is very limited. To telecommunications is very limited. They face a lot more barriers and it can be more isolating. We do have an organization here in Connecticut that provides advocacy for the deafblind community. In terms of language use, deafblind use ASL, they use tactile ASL. There's a new variation called protactile ASL or PT ASL, which includes ASL in a tactile version, but it also uses physical and touch cues to give some additional environmental information, such as you could use the body as a map to sort of draw where something might be, or you can use certain movements on the body to depict the audience's reaction and things like that. And I'm just answering another chat here about the organization in Connecticut. And one organization here is the Deaf Blind Association of Connecticut. We also have the Communication Advocacy Network. Those are the two. So those are the only two, but they're both really good organizations. Okay, we can go to the next slide. So the deaf community is small. It is very, very small, but it is quite diverse. Even in terms of hearing status or audiological access, really runs the gamut. There are those who can hear quite well. There are those like me who can't hear a thing. There are those who rely on using sign language, those who read lips and speak, or do a combination thereof. Even culturally, there's a variety. There's cultural subgroups within the deaf community. So there's Latinx culture within the deaf culture. There's a Black culture within the deaf culture. There are a lot of various subcategories within the community. And of course, we all interact together, but you can see people section off by sort of how they identify per those subcategories. So now socioeconomic, some deaf people work full-time, some deaf people work part-time, some don't work and rely on SSI or SSDI, some are college educated, some have their doctorate. Again, it really runs the gamut. There are deaf business owners. In terms of language, so, I'm using ASL today here for this presentation. However, back in the 70s still, there were still some deaf schools that were segregated at that time. And because of that, that sort of formed this creation of what's known as BASL or Black ASL. So it is a variation of ASL that is used by the Black deaf community. So there is that linguistic variation amongst deaf folks as well. Any questions about any of that? Okay, we can go on to the next slide. I'll give you a second to read through this here. So for a long time, people did not believe American Sign Language to be a true verified language, but it is. It has its own linguistic structures, its own grammatical rules, and it's not a spoken language. It's not. It's a visual and manual modality. So it's your brain interpreting all of this visual stimuli into language. And we use our facial expressions, we use spatial awareness, we use our bodies, all as a part of these linguistic components. And there are things that are required to be understood. If you are chatting with somebody, it is sort of required linguistically that you are animated, that you use your face to depict different grammatical components, and that you make your message very visually understandable. 90% of deaf people are born to parents who can hear. And the unfortunate part of that is what that means is that there are parents who are having deaf children who don't sign, which means that their children don't have access to deaf role models or to linguistic models or to a natural visual language, sometimes not until school aged or even later. And this is known as language deprivation. And some children will struggle to write of their life thus far. Oh, there's a question in the chat. Any questions about ASL itself? Okay, because this question says, are there more barriers for folks from other communities such as Black or Latinx to reach resources in their ASL? I would say partially yes. Sometimes the language is not accessible for them. You know, or sometimes there's a cultural linguistic dissonance too. So maybe you have a white interpreter showing up interpreting for somebody who identifies as Latinx and deaf, and there's just this mismatch. They're not able to get aligned linguistically. So yes, that does happen. And there are not enough teachers of color, interpreters of color. There's just not enough. Any questions about ASL before I move on? Is there much overlap between ASL and sign languages from other countries, such as British Sign Language, etc.? So a large proportion of ASL actually is derived from French Sign Language. And that is because there was a man, Gallaudet, featured in this picture, who encountered a young girl who was just playing by herself. And upon realizing that she was deaf, he was trying to figure out a way they could communicate. So he pointed to his hat and he drew out the letters for hat, H-A-T, in the sand, and saw that she was able to retain this label. And this girl was the daughter of a very wealthy person in Connecticut, and was so encouraged to see that his daughter had the ability to learn, because he was unsure, since there were no educational resources for deaf children at that time. There were in France, however, so this father funded Gallaudet's trip across the ocean to France to learn about how the deaf were educated. He met a deaf man named Laurent Claire, who returned with him to the States, and he agreed to come to the States to teach for a couple of years. And so on their journey back, Claire was able to teach Gallaudet French Sign Language. And when they returned, they set up the very first school for the deaf in the nation, which was American School for the Deaf in Hartford, Connecticut. So a large portion, like I said, of ASL comes from French Sign Language, but obviously as people mingled and used the language, it did form into its own American Sign Language.
Okay, you can go on to the next slide. Again, I'll give you a few seconds to take a look at this. Okay, so there are some differences between hearing culture and deaf culture. And certainly, as in many cultures, that's the case. In the deaf culture, we do tend to talk about money pretty openly, how much someone's earning, asking questions about people's private financial situations. It is very common amongst us simply because of the information sharing factor, whereas deaf individuals, oftentimes we have had oppression from the hearing community to hearing family members that may have taken money from us and so on. And it becomes a very difficult situation for deaf people to trust. So that exchange of information is very much expected and normal amongst the deaf community regarding money. Another difference is that we can talk about bodily functions pretty openly. In the hearing world, that's considered TMI in often situations, but that's something that's culturally been acceptable with us for a very long time. Having back in the day, before interpreters were part of our culture and part of the mandated laws, we didn't have interpreters at doctor's appointments and so on. And if we did, it were family members who may not really know sign language, or people we've met who can barely get by with the language. So for us to discuss our health with those of us who knew sign language was, again, considered an information exchange. And in today's day and age, we do have interpreters, but as we all know, a doctor's visit is oftentimes very brief, 5 minutes, 10 minutes at most, and we don't get everything we need always from as far as information from our doctors. So that information sharing continues in the community and culture. Information sharing, sometimes it's viewed as gossip in the hearing world, but in the deaf world, we don't look at it that way, especially back when we didn't have emails and phones or text messaging like we do in today's day and age. We wouldn't be aware of something that had happened in the world or to other members of our community, friends and family. So to ask about people and situations and knowledge about what has happened or hasn't happened is very common. Even though we do have technology today, we don't have as many deaf community social events as we used to in years past. And so we do take the opportunity when we have it to check in on other people that we may be aware of. In the deaf community, because it is such a small community, if I bump into someone, let's say from California, who's deaf, I may not know them, but in talking, we will inevitably discover that we have 2 or 3 people in common and make a connection based on that. If I get somewhere late, another cultural norm for us is if I get to a meeting or something and I get there late and somebody questions why I've gotten there late, it does typically happen where in the past, because we didn't have a mean of communicating our lateness with anyone, people would be waiting for us to get there and we wouldn't be able to relay that reason behind, maybe I got a flat tire or I got lost on my way to where I was headed. And needing to explain that is sometimes difficult. Deaf individuals do tend to be very direct. It may feel maybe critical or harsh when a deaf person says something, but we typically don't beat around the bush and kind of get to the point because of our language preferences. If I happen to meet someone who I had met years ago and that person was a little bit on the heavier side when we first met and now is much skinnier, I will very openly say, oh, wow, you've lost a lot of weight. You're really skinny. And the intent isn't to be rude. It's to question, are you healthy? Is everything okay? Has something happened? And it's very acceptable. And it is a means of supporting that individual and understanding that person a little bit better by asking. And the last item on this page is what we refer to as deaf standard time. A goodbye in deaf culture does tend to take a very long time before we actually leave and say goodbye. It's often common that we will say, "Oh, I'm leaving now," and an hour later, we'll still be wrapping up that long goodbye. It used to be that, with deaf gatherings being so minimal in years past, that being able to use the opportunity to catch up and have conversation with someone who speaks the same language was something we really held on to. And so leaving was more difficult than typical. Any questions about any of these differences? I see in the chat that somebody put that some of these differences are useful, and agreed. You can move on to the next slide. People are oftentimes unsure as to how to get a deaf person's attention. Sometimes they'll just stand and wait for a very prolonged period of time. Please know that tapping us, rubbing us on the shoulder to get our attention is completely acceptable. Another thing that sometimes is difficult for a deaf person is how you're dressing. Whether you're an interpreter or a presenter, we do tend to have them preferred to wear solid colors so that we can see their signing more clearly. So that would be that. You can go ahead and move on. So how to work with a deaf person, how to communicate with the deaf person. First and foremost, it's to be sure that you're facing the deaf person and that you're able to make eye contact. You can wave at a deaf person to get their attention. Oftentimes it's important to ensure that you don't have a bright light behind you or the sun right behind you where the deaf person is not going to be able to see you clearly. And most importantly, asking the deaf person what their preferred mode of communication is key. It's best to understand how the deaf person prefers to communicate in order to move forward. You may bump into a deaf individual in the community and write something down and allow them to kind of point things out and show you how they prefer to communicate. And just ensure that you are in a well-lit environment. You're on a flat ground where you're not, one person standing on a hill and another person down that hill trying to grasp at seeing each other. It's important that, you're kind of on the same visual field. You can go on to the next slide. So some tips as far as working and communicating with a deaf person. Making sure that you're making eye contact with the person you're speaking with and not the interpreter who may be present is a very important piece of the communication process. If you're not looking at the deaf person, it really does show a lack of respect, and understanding is really limited. And you don't need to say, tell the interpreter to, or you don't need to tell the interpreter to tell someone something. If you're speaking to a deaf person, you're speaking directly to that deaf person. The interpreter does not need to be told to relay the information. Additionally, as you're watching a deaf person speaking, maybe they're signing and you have an interpreter present, the interpreter might take a few moments to process what's being stated before voicing what's being said. And then that turn-taking process is something that you do need to become accustomed to in order to ensure a good flow of communication. And make sure that you're speaking clearly, that you're not mumbling or speaking very loudly. Speak at a normal pace, at a normal volume, just as you would with anyone else. And if there are PowerPoints or handouts or paperwork that needs to be taken care of, as I have done during this presentation, allow time for those things to be viewed before speaking on them. If you don't allow that time, then the deaf person will be looking down and not able to see what's being said when you're speaking. You can go on to the next slide unless somebody has any questions. So to tell a deaf person that they're responsible for providing their own interpreters is a no. Additionally, getting a family member or a friend who may sign very minimally or not at all to come in and have any sort of meeting or appointment of any sort of importance, whether it's legal or educational or medical. IEP meetings are included in this as well. You know, for somebody who's not fluent in sign, that's not providing communication access and is not something that's recommended because of the possible liabilities. And if you are struggling with trying to understand a deaf person, to just walk away and not allow there any real effort is just not okay. It really does fall on all of us to try to meet halfway and figure out how to get that communication to work. And if you're not able to do so, then asking the deaf person how to move forward, how to proceed, and what to do at that point in time is key. Oftentimes it will just be that the deaf person will say, we just have to get an interpreter present. Using pictures and text and different things to try to identify the communication that you're trying to relay is always allowable, but that doesn't ensure actual communication. So maybe planning for another time to meet again with an interpreter may be the best approach. Any questions so far? No? Okay. All right. So I'll allow you a moment to read. So we in Connecticut do not have many interpreters. You know, we have a limited number of interpreters. We are lucky to have some good interpreters in the state, and those interpreters always maintain a professional ethic. They are registered with the Registry of Interpreters for the Deaf, which is a national registry. There is also the Massachusetts Commission of the Deaf and Hard of Hearing that has their own interpreting exam, which interpreters in Connecticut are allowed to utilize that, possess that certification in order to interpret in our state as well. Those who are not certified are not able to interpret here in the state of Connecticut. You must be certified by either RID or MCDHH to be allowed to interpret here in Connecticut. All interpreters here in Connecticut must also be registered with the state of Connecticut as well on an annual basis. And that is a registry that is accessible online for you to check and confirm that the interpreter you're utilizing is certified and allowed to interpret in the state of Connecticut. An interpreter's role is to facilitate communication, and the person responsible for paying that interpreter is the business that is utilizing it, whether it's a hospital, a lawyer's office, a doctor's office, or so on. Interpreters must follow a strict code of ethics, meaning that anything that is discussed within a room needs to be interpreted. There can't be something that a hearing person says to the interpreter, please don't relay this to the deaf person in the room. The interpreter is bound ethically to do so. If you do want to have a private conversation, just like you would if a hearing person was in the room, you would need to leave the room to do so. And the last piece of the interpreter's ethical responsibility is maintaining that code of confidentiality and not sharing anything that they've interpreted with anyone outside of the interpreting situation.
So in regards to interpreters, there are some specializing that occurs within the field. So for example, if you were to, if a deaf person had to go to court for a legal matter, there are legally certified or legally trained interpreters because they are expected to be competent in those proceedings and in that jargon. The same goes for the medical field as well. And it's important that the interpreters are qualified for whichever setting they're supposed to be interpreting in, because not having a knowledgeable interpreter in that environment could cause quite the upheaval in communication. We also have certified deaf interpreters. And what that is a deaf person who interprets. That could be to a deaf-blind person. It could be to a person who is here from another country who doesn't know American Sign Language, or if they have some language idiosyncrasies. Any questions? If not, we can go on to the next slide. There's a question about confidentiality. So yes, interpreters are not to discuss anything they interpret with anyone outside of that context, outside of that specific situation. Let me see if I can put it another way. So if an interpreter interprets a counseling appointment, right? And then the interpreter is or a doctor's appointment, let's say, and now the interpreter and the client leave the room and the deaf person says to the interpreter, the doctor said this, right? The interpreter can't answer as themselves. They can go back in and interpret an interaction between the doctor or the medical professional and the deaf person, but they have to interpret and not just answer as themselves. Likewise, in court, an interpreter shows up, they mediate the conversation, and that's it. They are not to leave and discuss anything that happened in court with anyone. Not the location of the assignment, not the purpose of the assignment, nothing. Interpreters do sometimes debrief with other interpreters. They can talk about, they can process some of the traumatic things that they might interpret with one another, but they do still maintain confidentiality by ensuring they don't use names, locations, or other identifying information. When it comes to court, usually there's 2 or 3 different interpreters involved at once. So if you have a deaf defendant, there'll be an interpreter for that. If you have a deaf witness or a deaf person on the other side, then they would have their own interpreter. Each party would need to have a separate interpreter just to avoid any conflict of interest. And these interpreters do not work for a specific legal team. They are hired by the court. So if a lawyer were to hire an interpreter, typically that's for any meeting with them and their client, or that happens in their office, not in the courtroom. I mean, it is a little complicated and nuanced, but most courts do provide interpreters for the most part. Any questions? Okay, so I'm going to show a little clip here. There are some misconceptions where people think that lip reading is very effective. So I think if you just click on it, we should be able to watch it.
So when I was really young, probably kindergarten or first grade, I have a much older brother, and we'd go out to recess, and this older guy, he might have been in like 5th or 6th grade, and always used to pick on him, and I didn't really know.
Today we went to a high school and I was posing for a picture with all of my girlfriends, and all of a sudden one of them reached over. Can you read
My lips.
Can you read?
Can you read my lips? Can you read her lips?
My God, Clementine loves bread. She stole a loaf off.
Can you read his lips?
I have 2 dogs, 1 boxer, she's 7.5, 1 mixed breed.
I am deaf, but my word. What the is a hearing one? I rely on the visual, not the auditory. The word lip reading implies reading, like reading a book
whose text is legible and clear.
but the human face isn't a book, and lip reading isn't reading. People mumble, people talk fast enough loudly, people have facial hair like open arms, lips like sphincters, people cover their mouths, people have accents. But real conversations don't take place in the studio.
Growing up, I used
Putting together a puzzle without all the pieces. I look in on your mouth and try to grasp with one sense information intended to another. There have been times when I've questioned why I even tried to read, to wade through the spawn, but I could just use sign language. Some deaf people choose to do just that. It's like a different word, a word filled with rich expression and culture. When people sound, they come alive. But I know I want both words. Communication is never a given.
Tuesday, I woke up, had a
She
rash.
just pulled my vest down and
When I was little, my family got attacked.
Like Wednesday morning, hit him in the face. That was like the last thing that I ever.
Jenny
That's
pig.
when I learned to see. I only cried twice.
But when the reading works, would I focus on one notable face and launch into a conversation? Something clicks. Right then, I feel something extraordinary.
I know.
Even
Connection.
Okay, hope everyone was able to hear the parts that were audio anyways. Hopefully that worked for everyone. So the whole point here is that, you know, it was trying to depict how speech can sound to deaf people or can look to deaf people, especially if it's a noisy environment, there's a lot of competing sounds. It can be really difficult, and lip reading is not effective in many of those situations. We can go to the next slide. Okay, I'll let you read this. So lip reading, really only 30% can actually be read or is legible. The rest of the time you're making, best guesses, inferences. It can lead to a lot of errors, sometimes comedic errors, or it can lead to rather embarrassing moments. When you see deaf people depicted on TV shows and they show them lip reading, of course, it looks like they show them just having a very natural conversation as if it's not difficult at all. But in real life, that could never happen. Especially in these scenarios. So one, if somebody is extremely far away, it's just impossible to see their lips that acutely, that sharply. Often people's face is not clear for lip reading. Maybe they have a mask, maybe they have lipstick, maybe they have facial hair. Sometimes the lighting is not ideal and their face can be in the dark. There are some phrases or words that are easier to lip read or more common, so it makes it easier, such as hello, what's your name, how are you, I'm fine, goodbye, etc. Those are pretty simple and easier to catch. I think this might be a great time to take a break, because then we'll come back and resume with an activity. So Kelsey, does that sound okay? Does 5 minutes sound like enough of a break?
That sounds good to me.
Okay, great. So we'll come back at 2:05 then.
Kelsey, are the breakout groups ready? So we are going to do an activity now. And for you guys, you can look at this PowerPoint and the slide. And the intention is to not use your voice at all when mouthing the terms in here. And you can just kind of randomly pick them and see if somebody can figure out what you're saying.
Sorry, I just need one more second.
No problem. I'll put the words in the chat while you get that situated so people can use that as a reference. So it seems the consensus is how difficult it is. And so as you think about it, deaf individuals have to do this every day, all day. Oftentimes it's that thought of constantly thinking, what did they say, happening throughout our daily lives. There are many words that look the same on people's lips and on their mouths. And so it is important to kind of consider that that is something that we do struggle with on a daily basis. Go ahead to the next slide. So in talking about accessibility for the deaf, blind, and hard of hearing, years ago, Gallaudet University, which is a deaf university in the United States in Washington, D.C., they've had hearing presidents for many, many years. Finally, they had a deaf applicant who had the experience and knowledgeability as the hearing applicant who applied for the same position. Difference being that the hearing applicant could not sign. However, the deaf applicant could. Unfortunately, that hearing applicant was chosen over the deaf applicant. Because of that, there was a national revolution that took place amongst the students where they basically protested and said they wanted equality for both of the applicants. And that decision was overturned. And the deaf president was then elected as the president of Gallaudet University. Another issue is the Americans with Disabilities Act in 1990, which really did open up accessibility for deaf individuals, whether it's for trainings or interviews or doctor's appointments or fire alarms, having interpreters or modified smoke detectors, hospitals providing interpreters, really opening up access for us in ways that had not been available to us prior to that, and allowing the law to protect us. Is it a perfect system? No, but it was a step in the right direction. And then the third item here is the equity versus equality for the deaf, hard of hearing, and deaf blind. You know, I think that the news tends to have captioning. The caption is oftentimes incorrect and mistakes and errors are made. So the access that we're getting is not always great. During COVID, we did have interpreters sometimes present during the governor's or president's presentations, but oftentimes those interpreters would not be shown on the TV screen or would not be for the entire time, again limiting our access to anything. Another example of this is the movie theaters. They may often offer caption films. However, they're only on certain dates at certain times, and those are very limited dates and times. Hospitals have begun using VRIs, which is video remote interpreters, the interpreters on a TV screen that are not live and in person, which tends to be very difficult for deaf people. Having a live interpreter makes our access far more easy, but hospitals have been limiting that option for us, preventing our access even further. And then a side note about me, when I purchased my house years ago, the house didn't have any fire alarms within it at that time, as often is the case. So obviously I was told that, you know, these were things that we needed to purchase. And so like everyone else, I went to go price out the items I would need in order to provide that safety. It ended up being about over $2,000 for me to get the fire alarms that I needed, as opposed to a hearing person being able to walk into Lowe's and purchase one for maybe $60. So the price difference and equipment that is needed for those of us who are deaf also is prevented accessibility because of those differences as well. Next slide. Another example of our limited access was the Super Bowl. We always have a deaf individual signing the national anthem, and it is something that, you know, we really look forward to seeing. However, we never get to see the full national anthem. This year was a little bit better, where we did have that available to us in a picture-in-picture, but last year you had to have several devices in order to be able to access the signed versions of everything that was taking place during the Super Bowl or the halftime show. And not only did you need to have the additional devices, but you needed to know what websites to get on, what links to click on, and so on, really further in making it difficult for us to get on to those things, and really limiting the amount of time we were able to see. Any questions so far? Okay, we'll go on to the next slide. So bringing this back to your topic here, so the barriers of deaf, hard of hearing individuals who may be a survivor of sexual violence. Language is key. It is very difficult for those who may not have that communication access to even report the sexual violence. Additionally, We may have, you know, I know personally of a deaf individual whose husband was hearing. And although the deaf person had called the police to come and help, they came and spoke with the hearing husband and ignored what the deaf woman was saying and reporting, and listened to the hearing husband's version of events. That language access is key for somebody who's really in this situation. Not having access to services or help because of it is even more difficult. Additionally, community. The deaf community is very small, as I mentioned earlier, and there's very few secrets. So if something happens, everyone knows fairly quickly. So a survivor having any sort of privacy is very difficult within the community, and that is a stigma that's hard to overcome. Oftentimes, because of that, these things are not reported, or they'll go back to their abuser. And the reason being is knowing how small the community is, that they're not really able to escape. Even moving out of state doesn't prevent that from happening. Another barrier is that support groups are minimal, if at all. Oftentimes, a deaf person doesn't want to go to a support group because everyone there is someone they know if it is a deaf support group. And then if they want to join a hearing support group, the barrier is a different one. The culture is different. Having to go through an interpreter that may or may not be available to them is also another issue. Law enforcement, as I stated before, if somebody who's a police officer comes in and gives their attention to the hearing person and believes the hearing person and doesn't even acknowledge the deaf person's story or being, that's very much a barrier. And that's a common theme. You know, if there's accidents where a deaf person's involved, the police always listen to the hearing person's version of events before taking their time to get the deaf person's version. Another barrier would be interpreters. You know, there are some interpreters who may not be skilled in the field of sexual violence. And so finding an interpreter that's suitable and available can be very difficult. Additionally, some associations won't pay for those interpreters, and that's oftentimes another major barrier, especially if it's a nonprofit agency. They may not be able to afford to pay for interpreters, and that would prevent the accessibility from there as well. There are some who may live in, you know, the rural areas where there are not interpreters available, and waiting for one to become available is very lengthy and very difficult. Any questions? I see that there's a question for Kelsey in the chat. And I know that question is in regards to the funding available that may or may not be available with your agency. You know, again, go ahead.
Sorry, yes, I can. This is Jessie Gleffel. Kara, great question. And we've had a number of conversations about this. And I think one of the things that Kelsey and I talked about is following up with you, Tammy, to see if you have recommendations about this. But we're also going to kind of gauge how it went today, because this was something that came up previously. And what we were talking about was, you know, creating a contract like we do with the language line. So we have a language line that we use. And my understanding is that the way we currently have it set up is it's the Alliance's contract, and anyone in the coalition can use that contract. We've been talking about doing the same thing with a group of interpreters, so that we could have for ASL interpreters, because our understanding from the Alliance is that there's some real varied accessibility in terms of accessing ASL interpreters on a as needed or immediacy kind of basis. And so we are trying to figure that out. One of the things that did come up is one group that was recommended to us told us that we would not be able to do any training or kind of capacity building of the interpreters. And so we hesitated, and we're still kind of trying to look into that a little bit, because we do think it's important that we are able to bring in a little bit of the sexual violence piece of that, in part just to ensure people understand, and, you know, kind of some of the nuances that Tammy was talking about in terms of like how important it is for every word to be interpreted, and how critical that is. Also, because we want to make sure that interpreters also understand that they can access our services, right? So as an interpreter, they're still taking all of this information in, and we want to make sure that they too understand that our services are available to them. So yes, Kara, sorry, that was a very long explanation. Yes, funds are available. And yes, we are looking at a way that we can do it as a full coalition.
Okay, it says police should be required to get a certified interpreter. They should, yes. However, in an emergency situation, often on a last minute basis, it's very difficult to get interpreters as well as overnight. And often police feel that they don't have the time to wait, so they just proceed. And, because police aren't scheduled, they don't schedule visits, they can't, it's just interpreter schedules and the police schedules, it doesn't seem to work. It's very difficult to find an interpreter on a last minute basis. It's very difficult to schedule ahead with the police. It's sort of this conundrum. We can go to the next slide, I think. So if you encounter a deaf survivor, one way you can connect with them is to learn about deaf culture, but congrats, because you're all here today. So you've taken your first step. You can look to see if there are any deaf specific agencies who could provide support to this person or to your organization. They do exist, although they might be small. But there are resources available that you can collaborate with or you can take advantage of. You can also seek out technological ways or technological things that could be used in support of the survivor. And try to be creative, especially if you find that certain ones you were thinking of aren't available. Finding an interpreter who is familiar with sexual assault is very important, because we want to make sure that the interpreters are cognizant and delicate in terms of their sign choice. If an interpreter isn't trained in this field and the person's being asked about abuse, they might sign sort of the canonical sign for abuse, which depicts physical abuse. So the survivor might say, no, that didn't happen. However, it doesn't encapsulate all of the other types of abuse that we know exist. So we really need to make sure that the interpreters have training in this area as well. It's always helpful to provide a network or outreach. Look for different deaf events you can attend, maybe set up a booth at an expo or something. There are clubs, there are gatherings, there's the Connecticut Association of the Deaf that has various gatherings. Just try to keep yourself in the loop, that way you can provide that information to the survivor. You want to make sure that you provide and create a welcoming space. You want warm lighting, you want it to be inviting. If you know a little sign, or if you know some finger spelled letters, that always helps to form that connection. Eye contact will be very important for forming that connection. In terms of practicing new ways of sharing information, you could look up pictures to help you communicate. Or, you know, even if there's a complex sort of sequence of events that have occurred, you could set pictures, those pictures of various events up in the sequence that they occurred, to visually show information. And now in terms of communication with survivors, you know, it's not, we want to maintain that communication, that line of communication. We want them to continue to feel supported and that they can trust the person that they've connected with. You know, just check in on them, see how they're doing, get an update on what's going on with their court case or whatnot. Just keep in touch. You know, if that connection is just lost abruptly, it can be really confusing. So it is important to maintain contact. Someone in the chat said that my client preferred to not have an interpreter and I was uncomfortable at first. But yes, like you said, it is always best to honor the survivor's preference. You know, it can't be about your discomfort in communicating with them. You can say, okay, if you don't want an interpreter, okay, what are some other options that we could do? Or make sure you specify, is it this specific interpreter that showed up that you don't want? Is there a specific agency that you're not wanting to use? Or do you not want to use interpreters altogether? Just make sure you get clarity on their preference. And the person in the chat said that their client preferred to text. So as long as that was what their preference was, then that's fine. Are ASL interpreters mandated reporters? Yes. Any other questions? Okay, we can move on then. So various hearing devices such as cochlear implants or hearing aids, they do assist in hearing, they do amplify sound. Often some folks will wear hearing aids to help them maintain sound for environmental cues or background sound, but it does not fix, so to speak, their hearing. It does not make them hear like a person who can naturally hear does. And some people make the assumption that if a person doesn't have a device, that must mean that they are against these devices, but that's not true. I'm in full support of people choosing whichever modality they want to go with. Any other questions about this slide? Somebody asked in the chat, is it rude to ask a person if they have a cochlear implant or why they wouldn't want to have one? I guess my question would be, why would you want to know? What would be the purpose? Right. That was sort of my point, right? I mean, unless you need to know, then just leave it be, right? You know, in some circumstances, maybe the survivor does have an implant and it's broken or something, and you know, need to help them get it fixed. That's fine. That's purposeful, right? That has a reason. However, asking just out of curiosity, it's probably not appropriate. Okay, I think we can go to the next slide if there's no questions. So, of course, we have technological things that help us in our day-to-day lives. There are flashing lights for doorbells or for when the phone rings, for smoke detectors, for babies crying. That's a question we get asked a lot, actually, is what do you do if your baby's crying? How do you know? You know, and there are these signalers. Now, you know, my mother was deaf. They didn't have this technology back then, right? But obviously people are very creative. They have all sorts of different ways. We have survived, so I guess it was all okay. Of course, now with technology and smartphones, there are all these apps that make our lives so much easier. Now I can just order on DoorDash and food just shows up at my house. So a lot of technological advances have removed or remediated some barriers for us. Video phones are listed here. Quite a long time ago, there were TTYs that you might have been familiar with, those typing devices. Video phones were then the next influx of technology where deaf folks could see each other on a screen, or they could be connected with an interpreter on the screen. We also rely on captioning, interpreters. As I mentioned with the video phone, there are interpreters that we can connect with through that. They're called video relay service providers, VRS interpreters. They are the interpreters who make phone calls. And finally, very importantly, yes, we can drive. And actually AAA reports that deaf drivers are better drivers because we have those super powered deaf eyes and we are so watchful. And here, I just see another question here. Oh, someone mentioned their client has an app on their phone that works with their cochlear implant. And so, and you don't even need a cochlear implant actually to use apps like that. You can just have like a talk to text translation app. Now there are new features. We can now have interpreters appear on FaceTime. There's also something called VCO or voice carryover. So a deaf person who prefers to speak for themselves can still rely on an interpreter to relay what's being said auditorily, but then the deaf person can respond using their own voice instead of having the interpreter relay the information back. There was another question. How have equal access laws and policies impacted access? With the example you provided about the cost of fire alarms in houses, are the resources available to help offset the costs for deaf people? So there are various grants, but it's quite rare. To call it equitable is very far from fair. For any HUD or federal funded housing, they would be responsible for providing those accommodations, fire alarm flashers, doorbell flashers, etc., because of the federal funding. And like I said, there are various grants that will provide these types of equipment to deaf folks, but sometimes certain areas don't have grants for that. I mean, it really depends. Okay, we can go to the next one then. Okay, so some survival signs, you can all copy me. So, and these are particular to Connecticut. Some other states or locations might sign some of these concepts a little differently. Just as a little caveat. Okay, so the first one is rape, sign like this. Father. Mom or mother. uncle, brother, sister, family, stranger, abuse, that was the example I had used before. So because there are a variety of meanings to the word abuse, there are a variety of signs as well. If you're talking about physical abuse, it would be signed like this. Verbal abuse is like this. Oh, I don't know what happened to the slides here.
Sorry, I took them down because I thought it'd be easier to see you, but you probably need the list.
Yeah, I do. I do. That's
No
okay.
problem.
So sexual exploitation or sexual abuse, financial abuse, molestation would all be signed like this. Deaf. Some people sign it moving from their chin to their ear, others do ear to chin. Either way is fine. Doesn't matter. Hard of hearing, you make the H hand shape and bounce it like this. Hearing. Thank you. You're welcome.
Please. Excuse me. How are you? Sad. Nice to meet you. Hello. And then can I help you? Obviously, in person, it's a little bit easier for us to practice together with these types of things, but just to give you a rough idea. Do we have any questions at this point? Certainly, if there's any words that you're looking to have signed, let me know. I'd be glad to show you those as well. Okay, we can move on to the next slide. And then we can do these together. A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, J, K, L, M, N, O, P, Q, R, S, T, U, V, W, X, Y, Z. And this is the sign for I love you. And the reason for this is because of the letter I here, the letter L, and the letter Y combined, creating the sign I love you. You can certainly practice finger spelling your own names. I'll give you each a few minutes to do that. Okay, did you have success doing that? Great. I'm glad to hear some of you have had some luck with it. All right, we can go on to the next slide. And these are just some general recommendations that you certainly can take your time, to take a look at, watch or read about. Sometimes you can find some of these things on Facebook, some movies here, the movie Coda, as we talked about earlier. So again, there's some recommendations here as well, for those of you who may want to learn a little bit more and see a little bit more. There is an app I've listed here that is free for some basic sign language, and it's a great app for that purpose. And the next slide, we'll discuss some resources. And this is just some information. If you have some further questions, you can certainly look here on any of these resources to gather more information. And I do see a question in the chat in regards to recommendations for specific ASL classes. I'll always recommend that in-person classes are the best option, but I do know that, it's nice to have the online classes for convenience purposes. But as far as specific ones I'm recommending, I mean, you could certainly reach out to American School for the Deaf. They offer some classes, as well as a location in New London that I included in the resources too. But beyond that, you can certainly just look through any of these resources to find additional information. And we can close this PowerPoint and leave it for any additional last-minute questions. We do have 15 minutes if anyone has any additional questions at this point in time.
I was wondering if you know of interpreters in Connecticut you'd recommend specifically. You said folks that are more comfortable like having conversations about sexual violence or interpreting sexual violence, like if there's specific groups you would recommend for that.
As far as that goes, that it is really dependent on the interpreter specifically, and I don't know every interpreter in the state. What I would recommend is you reach out to agencies in the state, let them know the content that you'll be needing interpreters for, and they in turn can select the interpreters they feel fit that need. Okay, if there are no more questions, I think we can wrap up.
I think there is one more question in the chat.
Oh, I'm sorry, I must not have seen it. 1 second. Okay. Oh, so support for deaf and hard of hearing survivors. So the first thing is to first and foremost develop a relationship with that deaf person, allow that deaf person to make the decisions for themselves, not make any decisions for them. I feel like, those are the key pieces in order to really be supportive and maintain contact. Well, great. I hope that you each have learned a lot today. And if you do have a question that comes to mind after this presentation, please feel free to email me at any time and I'd be glad to answer it as best I can.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Tammy. Thank you to our two interpreters, Amy and Kaylee. This is obviously, as folks are saying in the chat, really helpful and a good start for many of us who are unfamiliar with deaf culture and some of the ways we can be providing better services to deaf and hard of hearing folks. So thank you so much. We'll hang out for a few minutes, but I encourage folks, if you don't have any questions, you can please fill out the evaluation that Amanda just put in the chat. I'm pretty sure. And we'll send a follow-up email as well with the resources that Tammy shared today and answers to some folks' questions. So you can look for that.
And thank you all for joining us today.